Hello there. In this video we will create a basic to-do app in plain JavaScript using Redux library. Now we are not gonna use React because learning Redux with React's perspective actually confuse you more rather than helping you learn it. So in this video we'll add a basic to-do app where you can add your to-dos and you can toggle your to-dos by clicking on them, and you can finally filter your to-dos based on the completed states. So let's get started. Let me create a new HTML file. I'm gonna name it index.html, and inside this page I'm gonna add some basic boilerplate code, and below the title I'm gonna add some styling to center all the elements on the page. Body, I'm gonna set the body height to 100% of the view height, and I'm gonna set the display to flex, and I'm gonna set the flex direction to column, and I'm gonna align the items to center, and I'm gonna justify the content to center. So now we have the basic styling setup. Let's add a form to our body. So I'm gonna remove this action attribute. Instead of that, I'm gonna add the name attribute, and I'm gonna set its value to form, and I'm gonna add the onSubmit event handler, and I will use a function called process form, which we'll define in a moment. And inside this form I'm gonna create a text box with a name, to do, and a button with content add. Now if I save, hit refresh, you can see that we are getting our form. And next let's define this process form function. So script, inside the script let me define the process form function, and inside this function by default we'll return false. This is to prevent the form from submitting. And let's console log the text box value, this .form.todo.value. So if I save, refresh here, type something and click add, you can see that we are getting our text box value. So now next let's add the Redux. We'll add Redux from a CDN. So search for Redux CDN and click the link from cdnjs.com and copy the minified version script tag and paste it below the title tag. By adding the script tag, we'll get a global object called Redux. So let's console log and see. Console.log Redux with capital R. Save, refresh. Let me close this page. Refresh here, you can see that we are getting our global Redux object, and this object contains many methods. Before learning what these methods do, let's first learn what Redux is and how it works. Now let's understand Redux using a simple analogy. Imagine you have 10 grand in your account and you want to withdraw $2,000 from an ATM. This ATM is same as store in Redux. After the authentication, the machine displays the withdrawal option and you select it. Then the machine will ask you to enter the amount and you enter $2,000. By selecting the withdrawal option and entering the amount, you are creating an action. In Redux, action is a plain JavaScript object with a property called type, which defines your action, and some payload. In our case, it is an amount. Next, this action is processed by the store using a function. This function will get your current state and your current action as its argument. Based on the type of the action, it will return a new state, which will be used by the store to replace its current state. This function is called reducer in Redux. Reducer is a plain JavaScript function which has two arguments, and these two arguments will be passed by the Redux store. The first one is your current state and the second one is the current action that you have passed. Based on your action, it will return a new state. So this is what Redux in a nutshell. You have a store and you dispatch some action. Based on that action, the reducer will return new state. That's it, nothing more. Store, action, reducer. These are the three things you need to remember to understand Redux. So now let's implement this concept in our to-do app. So now we have learned Redux. Let's define our store. To define the store, we have to use the createStore method from the Redux object. So let me remove this console log, and instead of that, let's define the store. And we will use the Redux createStore method. Now if I save and hit refresh in the browser, you can see that it is throwing an error. This is because this createStore method expects reducer function as its argument. So let's define our reducer function. I'm gonna name my function reducer. You can name whatever you want. And as you remember, our reducer function has two arguments. The first one is the state, the second one is the action. And inside this, for now we will leave this reducer function empty, and let's use that reducer function here. Now if I save and hit refresh, you can see the error is gone. Next, let's define our action. We'll define our action inside this process form function, because this function gets called whenever this form is submitted. So let me remove this console log, and inside this let's define an action. And as you remember, action is a plain JavaScript object. It will have a type property, and in our context the type property's value will be add to do, since we are adding to do. And I will add another property called to do. This will hold our to do object, and this object will contain a text property which will hold the text box value. So this dot form dot to do dot value, and I will add another property called completed. By default I will set it to false. This is because whenever a new to do is added, it will be in pending state, so I am setting the completed value to false. So now we have defined our action. We need to send this action to the store. To send this action to the store, we have to use one of the method that this store object contains. So first let's console log our store object and see what it holds. If I refresh here, you can see that our store object 2 contains many methods, and in order to send the action to the store, we have to use the dispatch method. So let's do that. Below our action declaration, I will call the store.dispatch, and I will pass the action variable here. So now we have done it. Let me refresh the page and type something and click add, and nothing happens. This is because our reducer function is empty. So before modifying our reducer function, let's console log both of its argument and see what it holds. So console log state, console log action is action. If I save, refresh here, type something and click add, you can see that we are getting our action object with our to do, but the state is undefined. This is because we haven't defined our initial state anywhere in our app. You can define your initial state in two places, either as a second argument to the createStore method or as an optional value to the state argument of the reducer function. I'll use the latter one. So our state will be an object. It will have a property called to-dos, which will hold all our to-dos. In the initial state it will be empty, so I'm adding the empty array, and I'm gonna add another property called visibility, and by default it should show both the pending and completed to-dos, so I will default it to all. And now we have done it. Let me refresh here, type something and click add. You can see that we are getting our initial state as well as our initial action. Before modifying anything, let me clear this text box whenever we submit our form. So after dispatching our action, let's set this text box value to empty string. So this dot form dot to do dot value is empty string. If I save, hit refresh, type something and click add, you can see that we are getting our state and action, and our text box is empty again. So let's modify our reducer function. Let me remove this console logs, and we'll check for the action type. So if dot action dot type is add to do, since we are passing that action and we'll be passing many action, that's why we need to check for the separate actions here. So if it is add to do, then we need to return an object same as the structure of our initial state. So it will have to do's property and it will have visibility property. Since inside this add to do action we are not modifying this visibility, we will return the visibility value from the previous state. So state dot visibility, and for to do's we'll concatenate the existing state to do's plus our action to do. So I will use the ES6 spread operator. So state dot to do's and action dot to do. This action dot to do we have defined here, it will hold our new to do. So we have concatenated our to do's and we are returning this visibility from the previous state. Now if I save, hit refresh, type something and click add, still nothing happens. This is because we have defined our store we have defined our action and we have defined our reducer, but we haven't defined an event listener to listen for the state changes. We can define our event listener using the subscribe method of the store object. So let me remove this console log, and instead of that, let's use the subscribe method, and this method expects a function, and inside this function, in order to get the current state, we have to use the get state method from the store object. So let me console log store.get state. If I save, hit refresh, add some to do and click add, it is throwing an error. This is because I have misspelled the function. So now if I save, hit refresh, you can see the error is gone. Now if I type something and click add, and we are getting our current state with our to-dos inside it. So instead of displaying here, let me display it on the page. For that, let me define an order list below the form, and I will add an ID called to-dos. And next, inside our subscribe function, let me remove this console log, and instead of that, first let's extract the to-dos from the get state. So const to-dos is equal to store.get state.todos, and first we will convert all the to-dos to a list item. So const list items is equal to to-dos.map, and for each to-do we will return a list item. So li, I'm gonna close the tag, and inside this li, and I'm gonna use the text property of the to-do. So now we have converted our to-dos to list items. Let's inner HTML to the ordered list. So document dot get element by ID to-dos dot inner HTML will be list items. Since list item is an array, we need to convert into a string by using the join method of the array and passing an empty string here. So now if I save, hit refresh, add some to-dos, you can see that it is appearing on our page. So now we have completed this. Let's add the toggling function of our to-do. Instead of adding the click event listener to the list item, let's add that to the ordered list, and by using the event delegation, we'll get our list item. So above the process form, let's call the document.get element by ID called to-dos, and I will add an event listener for click, and I'll pass a function which will have an argument called event, and let's console log that event and let me show you what it contains. So if I save, now if I add some to-do here and click that to-do list item, you can see that it is console logging the mouse event, and inside this mouse event there is an attribute called target, and this target will be our list item. Since we are clicking the list item, the target will be our clicked list item. Now if I further expand our target attribute, you can see that it contains a property called node name which defines to list item. Now we will use this node name property to check whether this click is coming from a list item. So instead of console logging it, let's use it event.target.node name is list item. Then now to toggle our to do, we need to get the index of our to do. So let's modify inside the subscribe function. We'll add an index argument to the map function, and we will set the data attribute to our list item called index. So this value will be index. Now to access this data attribute, we have to use, let me console log that and show you, we have to use the event.target. Since target is a list item, to access the data attribute we have to call the dataset attribute, and we'll use the index. Since we are defining data attribute as index, we will use that index property to get the value. So now if I save, now if I refresh, add some to do, now if I click that to do, you can see that it is outputting 0 because this is the first element in the array, so it is 0. So instead of console logging, we'll define an action for toggling, toggle action. Remember, action is an object with type property. Here the value will be toggle. We'll pass the index value from the event.target.dataset.index. Now we have defined our action. Let's pass this action to the store using the dispatch method of the store toggle action. Next we will add another condition to our reducer to listen for this action. If action.type is equal to toggle, then we will return the same structure as our state. So to do's will have another property called visibility, and since we are not changing visibility, we will return the visibility from the current state. So state.visibility, and for to do's we will map each to do's, and this map will have a function with two arguments. The first one is the to do, the second one is the index, and we will check if this index is equal to the actions index. If it is, then we will toggle the completed value of the to do, and finally we will return all the to do. We'll return the to do. So now we have listened to that action. We need to show it visually. For that we'll further modify our subscribe function. So instead of returning the list item, let me define it as a variable. So let element is equal to that list item. If this to do is completed, then instead of returning a list item, we'll add a delete tag to it. So return del, and inside this del tag we'll add our element variable, or by default we'll return just that element. So now if I save, click refresh, add some to do's, and if I click any of the to do, you can see that it is toggling. Now we have completed the toggling feature. Let's add the visibility filter. So for that, let me define a div below the form, and inside this div I'm gonna define a bold tag, and I'm gonna add a text called visibility. And next I'm gonna add 3 anchor links. The first one will be all, the second one will be pending, and the third one will be completed. And I'm gonna add on click event listener for all these 3 anchor links. So on click, and we will use a function called filter, which will define in a moment, and this function will have 2 arguments. The first one is the event, which will be passed by the browser, and for the second we'll provide all for the all anchor link, and for on click filter event we'll pass pending for the pending, and click filter event completed for completed. So now let's define this function above the process form function filter event visibility value. So now let's first we need to prevent the anchor link from submitting. So event.prevent default. Next we will define an action. Let filter action is equal to an object. It will type with a type called filter, and we will pass the visibility value visibility. So now we have defined our action. Let's send it using the store.dispatch method filter action, and now we need to listen for this action inside our reducer function. So let me add another condition, action.type equal to filter. If you are filtering, let me return the same structure as our state. So to do's and visibility. Since we are not changing anything in our to do's, we'll return the to do's from the current state. So state.to do's, and for visibility we'll use the value from the action. So action.visibility. Now we need to filter it inside our subscribe based on our visibility filter. So before mapping we need to add the filter function, and this function will have another function, and this function will have argument called to do, and by default we'll return false. And then above that we'll check if. Before checking this, let me extract the visibility value from the state. Const visibility is equal to store.get state dot visibility. Now if visibility is equal to all, we'll return all true. We'll return all the to-dos. Else if visibility is set to pending and this current to-do is pending, it's not completed, then we will return true. If visibility is completed and to do is also completed, then we will return that. We can further simplify this, but in order to understand easily, I am writing like this. So now we have done it. Let me refresh the page. You can see we are getting our visibility filter links. Now if I add some to-dos, now I can toggle the to-do. Since initially it will be in all filter, now if I click the pending, you can see that completed to-do is gone. Now if I click the completed, you can see that only the completed to-do is showing. Now we have completed our to-do app, but there is some redundancy inside our reducer function. You can see that inside this add to-do action, even though we are only changing the to-dos property of our state, we have to return the visibility value from the previous state just to maintain the structure of our state. And we are doing the same thing inside this toggle action also. You can see that we are changing the to-dos value, but we are returning the visibility value from the previous state. And inside this filter action, we are changing the visibility, but we have to return the to-dos from the previous state just to maintain the structure of our state. Now imagine you have 100 properties in your state, and for each action you most probably changing just a single property, but you have to return all the other 99 properties just to maintain the structure of our state. So we can eliminate this redundancy by using separate reducer for each property in our state. Since we are having two properties in our state, we'll have to define two functions. The first one is for the to-dos, so we'll name it as to-dos reducer, and it will have two arguments same as our parent reducer, but we'll change the first argument's value name to to-dos, and for the second we'll call action, and inside this we'll check for the action type. So action.type is equal to add to do. Then we'll concatenate both our to-dos and action to do. So to-dos and action.to-do. Now we'll check for another condition. Else if action.type is toggle, then we'll return only the to-dos, and we'll skip the state and return, copy it and paste it here. Now we won't check for the filter action because we are not changing our to-dos inside this filter action. So instead of that, by default, if no condition satisfy, we will return the to-dos that is passed to it. So we have defined the reducer for our to-dos. Let's define the reducer for visibility property. So visibility reducer, and the first argument will be the visibility, the second argument will be the action, and inside this we are not going to check for the add to do or toggle action. Since we are not changing anything inside this action, we are just returning the visibility value from the previous state. So instead of that, we'll check only for the filter action. So if action.type is equal to filter, then we'll return action.visibility. Now if no condition satisfy, we'll return the visibility value that is passed to it. So now we have defined both of our reducer. Let's remove all the condition inside our parent reducer. So instead of that, we'll return an object which will have the same structure as our initial state. So to-dos, and we will call the to-dos reducer for our to-dos property, and for the first value it will be the state.todos, and for the second we'll pass the action as it is. And let's define the visibility. We'll call the visibility reducer. The first value will be the state.visibility, and we'll pass the action as second argument. Now if I save and hit refresh here and type something, click add, you can see that everything works normally. Now we can further eliminate our parent reducer using one of the method that Redux object contains. So first let's console log our Redux object, and let me show you which method it is. So if I save and refresh, it has many methods, but in order to eliminate the parent reducer we have to use this combined reducers method. So below our parent reducer, let me define a variable same name as our parent reducer. So reducer redux dot combine reducers, and this method expects an object, and this object will be the same structure as our state. So the first will be the todos, and we will have to assign the todos reducer to it. You don't need to call the todos reducer, you just have to assign this todo reducer. And for the visibility, we'll use the visibility reducer. Now we will delete our parent reducer. Now since we haven't defined our initial state anywhere, we will pass the todos optional value, which is empty array, and for visibility, which will be initially all. So now if I save, hit refresh, add something, you can see everything works as it is. So now we have successfully completed our Todo app, and we have removed lots of redundancy in our code. In the next video, we will implement Redux in React by creating the same Todo app. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for new upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.